My name is Chris Campion, Field Operations Specialist at Novinium. We have a freshly prepared cable, and what I'm going to do now is show you how to install a connector and an IA for SPR injection. And what that involves is the swaging process that we use for a radial swage die to give a superior connection to the conductor through the connector. So all the tools that we'll need are right here. We have our tool stop, as we saw in cable preparation. We'll use this to align the swage heads with the swage dies, and that'll allow us to create a correct radial compression. We'll also need an alignment pin and bushing for aligning the IA. We have two different types of V spacers. Only one of them will be used for the IA that is chosen for the job, so be sure to check back in the NRIs for which is the correct spacer to use. You'll need a screwdriver to be able to install the swage dies into the heads. You'll of course need a compression connector and an IA. Also have handy a wrench so that you can tighten down the tool stop. Make sure that you have your DMC unit or alternative swage press, as well as your interpack pump and a supply of CO2 to drive your pump. It's important to keep your swage dies on a clean surface. That's because any dirt or debris that gets in between the teeth of the die, once the swaging actually begins, it'll compress, and compressing any rocks can lead to damage of the die itself. And in turn, when you're swaging the IA, it can damage and potentially crack the IA. So before you start swaging, you'll need to assemble your swage head with the correct die. Now, the first thing that you want to do is you want to take whatever IA that you have and check the IA reference table. So here I have a printed out copy, and this IA in particular is the 2.2. So we look at the chart, and it has the insulation die and the lug die, which is the connector. And it tells me that for the 2.2, we need an 842 and a 742. So here I have already installed an 842, but I do not have the 742 in the head. So you want to first lubricate, which I've done previously, lubricate the die and place it into the swage head and screw down the end plate. Making sure that it's fitted correctly. So that's in. Do the same thing for the other side. Now the dies are in the head. Now they're ready to be fitted into the swage press. The way that you put the swage head into the die, or into the press, is you take the lower block, press in the key, and place it onto the piston. And make sure that it's on there securely. Then you take the horseshoe, line it up in the groove, and then now it is secure. So now you can take the head and begin swaging. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to position the IA for the connector swage. In order to do this, we need the tool stop, we need our alignment pin and bushing. Take your IA, find the pinhole, place the alignment pin inside the pinhole, take your tool stop, place the IA into it. Now, depending upon the size of the IA and what swage dies are required to compress it, you will either have the tool stop with the rounded shoulder facing up, like I have here, or the tool stop will be with the flat side up. For smaller IAs, this is typically the orientation with the rounded shoulder up. So what you do is you want to make sure that the bushing is flat against the tool stop, and tighten the tool stop down. Of course, you want to check to make sure that there's no space between the bushing and the tool stop. If there is, loosen it and readjust. It's important to have this spaced correctly because you want to line up the swage in the right spot. Otherwise, you could potentially damage the IA. After we've placed our IA in the tool stop, we want to train the conductor strands to make it easier on ourselves when we have the IA on the cable itself. So either take your connector or a similar size connector and place it onto the strands. After we've trained the conductor strands, we want to make sure that the IA is properly spaced so that when we swage, the die will not compress in the wrong spot. So we take our IA in the tool stop, one part of the swage die block, and simply place it against it. The die has a certain width to its teeth, and this should line up with the edge of the swaging surface on the IA. As you can see here, the edge of the die is pretty much in line with the swaging surface. So that means this is properly aligned, and we can swage this without fear of swaging the middle part of the IA and possibly cracking it. So to use the Enerpac pump, we must have the correct pressure being fed to it. Enerpac pump's working pressure range is from 60 to 100 psi, or 120 psi. So a good rule of thumb is to set it to 100. So we open up the gas tank, dial up the pressure. So now that we have our swage tool prepped and ready to go, our conductor has been trained to fit inside the connector, we will now begin swaging the IA first on the connector side. So we first place the IA over the cable, and then we'll put our connector back on. Now, before you go beyond this point, you want to make sure that there is a little bit of play in the IA to jiggle around. And what that does is it allows you to know that the conductor has fully inserted into the connector. So there is a little bit of movement there. Next, we take our swage tool. And what you want to do is you want to rest this flat backside of the swage tool flat against the tool stop. And this can be a two-person job. It takes a little bit of coordination between the two people. When you have that ready to swage, make sure. So I have the tool stop flat against the swage head. I'll begin swaging. Now when the two shoulders of the swage head meet, swage for 2 to 3 seconds longer, and what that does is it ensures that you have a complete swage. Now if you look at, if you have an inline hydraulic gauge, it should read up to 9,000 psi, and that is by the NRI when the complete swage is done. So at 9,000 psi, it's finished. You can release. Now check your IA. Make sure that it's swaged in the correct location. Checking for any cracks. That looks good. So our connector side swage is complete. Take your tool stop. Now we'll move to the insulation side swage. Okay. To swage the insulation side of the IA, you'll most likely have to switch the dies that you had in your swage press. Once again, refer back to your IA reference table, which is in the NRIs, to make sure that you have the correct die. So I'm going to swap my 742 dies out for the 842. Now to position the swage die for the swage on the installation side and the tool stop, you'll need to use one of the two V-spacers that are supplied. What this does is you place the V-spacer behind the IA. Of course, you have to put the tool stop on first. Put the V-spacer behind the IA and in between the tool stop. Place them snug against each other and then tighten down. Each IA has a specific spacer that it uses, so refer to your IA reference table to find out. In this case, the 2.2 uses the gray spacer. Tighten down. Now, just like the connector side, you want to make sure that it is spaced correctly. So you once again take your die and line it up against the tool stop. And it should line up similarly to the other side. In this case, the die teeth do line up in the right spot, and so we can begin swaging. So once again, place the swage head flush against the tool stop. And once you're ready to go, begin swaging. So the shoulders have met again. Continue swaging a little bit more. If you have an inline gauge, it should read 9,000 psi again. Once you're done, you release. Again, examine your swaging. Make sure that there's no cracking. At this time, begin looking for rough edges. If you see any rough edges, make sure to smooth those out. Use a file or 120 grit sandpaper. This looks pretty good, so I have now installed the IA and the connector. Now one last double check. Take your template and line it up against the finished product. So we're looking pretty good there. So we've just finished installing our IA and connector. It's always important to make sure that you reference the IA reference table and the NRIs for procedures. They will give you valuable information to how to correctly install and place the swage dies when installing the IA. At this time, installation is complete. Now we can move on to SPR injection, where we will hook up our injection equipment to the cable and begin injecting fluid into the cable, leaving pressure in the cable per NRI and completing rejuvenation.